끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Coming up on Arirang News. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol for 5 days starting this Saturday is set to visit Saudi Arabia and Qatar, seeking to bolster business cooperation and regional security linked to the Israel and Hamas conflict. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov thanks North Korea for its support on the war on Ukraine. He holds talks with the North's leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, and their meeting is speculated to have laid the groundwork for Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to the regime. For the first time, the United States' nuclear-capable strategic bomber, the B-52, lands on South Korean soil. The U.S. Air Force says this is to show ironclad commitment to secure peace and stability on the peninsula. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. We begin with President Yoon Suk-yeol's upcoming trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Traveling with a delegation of corporate chiefs, he aims to boost economic cooperation with the two countries and is expected to discuss the security situation amid the Israel-Hamas conflict. He'll be the first Korean leader to make official state visits to the two Gulf states. Our correspondent Oh Soo-young has a preview.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will seek broader economic ties with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and discuss efforts for regional stability amid the Israeli-Hamas conflict as he becomes the first Korean leader to make an official state visit to Riyadh and Doha. Yoon's office said the President and First Lady Kim Jong-un will head to Saudi Arabia on Saturday for a 4-day stay. His official schedule begins Sunday with a bilateral summit and luncheon with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, followed by an investment forum with over 300 Korean and Saudi firms. Yoon will also visit academic institutions to promote further cooperation in the private sector and people-to-people exchanges, and commemorate 50 years of Korea and Saudi cooperation in the construction sector. The South Korean leader will head to Doha on Tuesday and drop by the International Horticultural Exposition before holding bilateral talks on Wednesday with Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. He'll then attend the Korea-Qatar Business Forum before visiting the country's education city. As Yoon's 6-day trip to the Middle East comes amid concerns that the Israeli-Hamas conflict could result in broader clashes in the Gulf region. Yoon's Deputy National Security Advisor said regional security will be high on the agenda during Yoon's summits with the Saudi and Qatari leaders.
Through this trip, we hope to strengthen practical cooperation with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, while also discussing ways to achieve peace in the Middle East and strengthen our own security. The trip is also meaningful in that, as a global pivotal state, South Korea will contribute to discussions on challenges facing the international community.
Also amid concerns of North Korea cooperating with actors like Hamas, Iran and Russia, a senior Yoon official said the president could well raise the issue in this bilateral summit, as Ho seeks greater support in clamping down on Pyongyang's illegal weapons cooperation and evasion of global sanctions. More than anything, the key feature of Yoon's trip will be his economic diplomacy drive, expanding the scope of bilateral business relations from energy and construction to diverse new industries.
38% of our crude oil imports and 21% of our gas imports come from both those countries. As Saudi Arabia and Qatar prepare for the post-oil era, it's time for us to explore new partnerships. More than 70% of the economic delegation will be small and medium-sized companies whose industries are diverse, covering energy and construction, as well as digital, finance, medical and cultural content.
The president will be accompanied by 130 Korean corporate chiefs, including the leaders of Samsung, Hyundai Motor and Hana, to Saudi Arabia, and nearly 60 business leaders to Qatar. This comes as South Korean construction and shipbuilding firms look to procure big contracts in constructing Saudi's Neom megacity and building LNG carriers for Qatar. Beyond business ties, the top office says Seoul will also look to increase cooperation and exchanges in education, culture and tourism as the countries forge future-oriented relations going forward. 오수영, Arirang News.
President Biden has now wrapped up his trip to Israel, having reaffirmed unwavering support for the country and worked on allowing humanitarian aid move into Gaza through the border with Egypt. Our Yoon-hee has analyzed the outcome of his high-stakes trip.
U.S. President Joe Biden concluded his visit to Israel on Wednesday, which had the goal of demonstrating support for Israel while reducing the chances of a broader conflict and also ensuring that he was fully attentive to the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Following the cancellation of a previously scheduled summit in Jordan, President Biden departed the region without any in-person meetings with Arab leaders.
Biden's visit to Israel accomplished two things. The first one is it did seem through his conversations with the Egyptian president, Sisi, to open up a corridor for humanitarian goods to flow into Gaza, which I think is a really important accomplishment, at least in the short term. Obviously, this is just a Band-Aid on a much larger wound, but it's certainly better than what we had before.
While flying back to Washington, Mr. Biden talked to Egyptian President El-Sisi, who agreed to reopen the border with Gaza and let 20 humanitarian aid trucks through. The U.S. leader said he wanted to make sure this could happen quickly, and he praised El-Sisi for being very cooperative. Another possible outcome is that Biden's discussions in the region and Washington's defense and State Departments deter the conflict from broadening and encompassing potentially Hezbollah or Iran or other actors. In this regard, his visit seems to have helped ease tensions to some degree.
The other thing I think that's important outcome of this is that the Biden administration does seem to have decided, and probably this helps push it forward, to ask Congress for several $1 billion in aid that's going to be combined for an aid package for Israel and Ukraine to go along with a $100 million aid package, which has been announced to go into Gaza and the West Bank.
Amid the tensions in Arab nations after the hospital blast in Gaza, there are conflicting claims about who was behind it. Biden said data from his Defense Department showed that the explosion was not likely to have been caused by an airstrike by the Israeli military. But there are conflicting views as to whether Biden's visit has done anything to help an already inflamed region. The anger there is rumble on regardless, with each side looking to place blame at the door of others. Yoon-hee, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has decided to provide humanitarian assistance worth $2 million to help those affected by the war between Israel and Hamas. The Foreign Ministry announced Thursday that it'll closely consult with relevant entities to ensure the assistance is used for humanitarian purposes. It also expressed deep concerns about the rapidly increasing number of civilian casualties in the region, adding South Korea will work together with the international community to end the conflict and casualties. It also urged parties to comply with the international humanitarian law and take measures to protect civilians. Angry protests rage on against Israel across the Middle East and North Africa following a blast at a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds of people. Yoon-jin reports.
Following the deadly blast on Tuesday night on a hospital in the Gaza Strip that killed nearly 500 people, a former Hamas leader called for a worldwide day of rage. And thousands of people have rallied in countries across the Middle East and North Africa to protest. On Wednesday, demonstrators gathered outside U.S. embassies. As the Jordanian government declared 3 days of mourning, thousands of people gathered outside the U.S. and Israeli embassies, where Islamic parties in the country called for a general strike. In the Lebanese capital, Beirut, protesters clashed with security forces who used water cannons to disperse crowds close to the U.S. embassy. Overnight, demonstrations also took place in Turkey, Morocco, Libya, and Iran. Meanwhile, the conflict between Israel and Hamas is causing reverberations throughout Europe, from demonstrations to hate crimes and terrorist attacks. Early on Wednesday morning, 2 hooded men threw Molotov cocktails at a synagogue and a Jewish community center in central Berlin. Local police said there were no reports of injuries or damage.
They said this night they will try to burn the building. There were two Molotov cocktails thrown on the building at around 4 o'clock in the morning. So nothing happened. The bottles apparently didn't reach the building.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is currently in Egypt after visiting Israel on Tuesday, condemned the attacks and said anti-Semitism has no place in Germany.
It is completely clear that we do not accept this and will never accept it when Jewish institutions are attacked, and that events and activities which turn violent or use anti-Semitic slogans will not be accepted.
Meanwhile, in France, several airports were evacuated on Wednesday after receiving emails containing threats of attack. And following Monday's deaths of 2 Swedish citizens in a stabbing in Brussels, the leaders of Belgium and Sweden met on Wednesday with the EU's chief executive to discuss the security gap in the bloc's management of migration and asylum. The attack in Brussels was allegedly carried out by a Tunisian national who was in the country illegally after an asylum application was rejected in 2020.
One specific dimension relates to individuals who are considered a security threat and have received a return order. Currently, they can be asked to leave voluntarily. We must urgently change this.
Von der Leyen said the bloc's next migration pact would help avoid such situations by allowing state authorities to more quickly deport foreigners who are deemed a threat to national security. 이은진, Arirang News.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov today met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, the two talked for more than an hour, but few details about their conversation have been made public. At a press conference, Lavrov said there was a highest-level contact a month ago between the two sides and that there was high-level contact today. He also said that he's sure this contact will continue, setting the stage for a possible visit of President Vladimir Putin to North Korea. Before meeting with Kim, Lavrov talked with North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee and thanked North Korea for its, quote, unwavering and principled support for Russia's war on Ukraine. He also said Russia supports establishing a regular negotiation process on security issues on the Korean Peninsula without any conditions. Choi said the countries were building what she described as an unbreakable comradely relationship. The U.S. Air Force showcased its strategic bomber on Thursday, saying its deployment to the Korean Peninsula is incredibly important in showing U.S. commitment to the defense of South Korea. This comes as a bomber made a rare landing at a South Korean airbase. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung explains the significance.
The United States nuclear-capable bomber, the B-52, landed in South Korea on Tuesday at an airbase in the city of Cheongju. It was the bomber's first-ever landing at a Korean airbase and did so after flying over Seoul Air Base at the opening ceremony of ADEX, or the Seoul International Aerospace and Defense Exhibition 2023. The bomber had previously been deployed over the Korean Peninsula for joint air drills, but had never before landed on Korean soil. Speaking to the press on Thursday, the U.S. Air Force explained that it was proud to be able to participate in the event to demonstrate U.S. commitment.
This B-52 mission is part of our overall support to the air show, the Seoul ADEX, but it is part of our demonstration to the Republic of Korea and its people and its government that we stand by our allies, that we have an ironclad commitment to secure the peace and stability of this region. That is incredibly important to us.
The U.S. Air Force also highlighted the strengths of the B-52.
We have various mission sets such as strategic attack, air interdiction, close air support, and obviously we also support the nuclear enterprise. So we are very flexible, and I think the unique thing about the B-52 is the fact that we can support so many different mission sets.
On the same day, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Kim Seung-yeom was given a tour of the B-52 bomber. Kim emphasized that the deployment of the strategic bomber demonstrates Washington's will and ability to fulfill its ironclad defense and extended deterrence commitments on the Korean Peninsula amid heightened nuclear threats from North Korea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff stressed that it is also part of U.S. efforts to increase the regular visibility of strategic assets on the peninsula. The bomber conducted a combined air exercise with South Korea's F-35A fighters on Tuesday, and it is also expected to take part in the first ever joint air drills between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan this weekend. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The International Atomic Energy Agency has started collecting samples of fish caught off the coast near Fukushima for the first time. It'll be an annual monitoring procedure following Japan's release of wastewater into the sea back in August. Japanese public broadcaster NHK reported Thursday that a team made up of experts from the IAEA and also from South Korea, Canada, and China collected more than 70 kilograms of fish from Hasanohama fishing port in Fukushima Prefecture. The IAEA and experts from 3 countries plan to analyze the radioactivity in the fish and will release a report based on their findings. The Korean government vows to bolster the medical system for areas outside the capital, often marginalized when it comes to critical health services. Eyes are now on the government's push to increase the quota at medical schools, against which doctors' groups oppose. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The government is making structural reforms in the medical infrastructure system to make sure non-urban and rural areas receive quality services in essential fields. President Yoon Suk-yeol acknowledged the severity of the situation on Thursday, noting certain areas were being neglected with regard to essential medical services as rural hospitals are unable to compete with large private hospitals in Seoul.
국민 건강과 생명에 직결된 지역 필수 의료가 붕괴되고 있습니다. 소아 청소년과 산부인과 같은 필수 진료 과목의 인력 수급이 어려워 적기에 치료를 받지 못하는 국민들이 많습니다. 또 지역 간 의료 격차 문제도 심각한 수준에 이르렀습니다.
The comments came at a strategy meeting on essential medical innovation at Chungbuk National University, where Yoon met with directors of national university hospitals to discuss how to tackle this issue. As part of President Yoon's plan, these national university hospitals scattered across the country will be fostered as core providers of essential health services under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Health and Welfare. They were previously under the Education Ministry. Another key issue for the government at the moment is to expand the number of students accepted annually at medical schools. Over the past 18 years, South Korea has kept the number of newly accepted students at 3,058. The government, citing that the OECD average for the number of doctors per 1,000 people is 3.7, whereas in South Korea it is 2.6, said raising the cap was inevitable. However, this could come with a backlash, as the previous Moon Jae-in administration attempted to do the same thing, stirring up strong opposition from doctors. That said, President Yoon has taken a cautious approach while acknowledging the need to increase the number of doctors. Other measures will support the changes.
산부인과, 소아과 등 필수 분야에 인력이 유입될 수 있도록 법적 리스크 부담을 완화하고 보험 수가를 조정하고 보상 체계의 개편이 아울러서 뒷받침되어야 합니다.
President Yoon added that medical restructuring was ultimately for the people, as the country's #1 purpose is to protect their lives. The president also sees this issue as one of balancing regional growth, saying the lack of quality medical services in suburban and rural areas was why people were not moving into them. Additionally, the matter is directly related to the nation's economic growth. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea's central bank holds its key interest rate steady at 3.5% again for the 6th time, as economic recovery remains its top priority. This is despite concerns over inflation and oil price hikes due to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Our Shin Ha-young has the details.
The Bank of Korea has again held the country's key interest rate steady at 3.5%. The decision was announced on Thursday following a Monetary Policy Committee meeting.
Uncertainty over inflation and economic growth increased due to prolonged monetary tightening in major countries and rising geopolitical risks. It is expected that the easing of the inflation rate will be more gradual than initially expected. Considering such factors, we have decided to keep a tightened monetary policy. The Board of Governors voted unanimously to maintain the current tightened stance.
This is the sixth consecutive time that the BOK has decided to keep their rate unchanged. The base rate has been held at 3.5% since February, following 10 consecutive rate hikes aimed at taming inflation beginning in August 2021. Analysts say uncertainty about economic recovery was the main factor behind the decision, as aggressive rate hikes could further hinder economic growth. While there are signs of a rebound in exports, a downturn in consumer spending is raising uncertainty about the country's economic recovery. Inflationary pressure, soaring household debt, and the exchange rate market are factors hindering the BOK from cutting rates. The governor of the BOK said at a press conference that the pace of inflation decline may not be as fast as the bank predicted in August. 2 months ago, the bank forecasted this year's consumer price growth at 3.5% and next year's at 2.4%. Regarding the impact of the Israel-Hamas conflict on global financial markets, he said it's raising economic uncertainty, but it's difficult to make any sort of prediction. He also added that the U.S. benchmark interest rate would be affected by the volatility in global oil prices. On the back of the BOK's latest decision, the rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. still stands at 2 percentage points.
If the U.S. is continuing to signal that it may raise the interest rates, I think it's much too early right now for Bank of Korea to signal that they are going to lower the rates, or even they are not going to raise rates any further.
The Bank of Korea says that most committee members think it's necessary to consider rate hikes due to rising inflationary pressure. On the other hand, the need for flexibility in both rate hikes and cuts was also raised during a time of growing economic uncertainty. 신하영, Arirang News.
The latest efforts to reduce the carbon footprint are coming from the European Union. There's something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. Our Moon Hae-ryun has the details on just what it is and how South Korea is planning to respond to this new policy.
The transitional period before the full implementation of CBAM for countries exporting goods to the EU, including South Korea, began this month. CBAM is a measure aimed at preventing what's called carbon leakage, when a company moves its production facilities from a country with strict carbon emission policies to one with more lax policies. With CBAM, production facilities based outside of the EU will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as sites within the bloc using the original emissions trading system. From the beginning of this month up until the end of 2025, only greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported without needing to make any financial payments. But from 2026, importers will need to declare the quantity of goods being brought into the EU in the preceding year, as well as what's called their embedded greenhouse gas emissions, which are greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production and transportation of goods. They will then have to surrender the relevant number of CBAM certificates priced at the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances. The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected as producers of what the EU defines carbon-intensive goods: cement, iron, steel and aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. Steel and aluminium exports are predicted to drop by more than 1/5 because a survey showed that more than half of South Korean companies who exported goods to the EU and plan to do so in the future do not have any plans in place for CBAM. An industry insider said that the reason behind this is because SMEs don't have the capacity to prepare for new situations like this, and the EU has not yet released detailed guidelines.
Another reason is that there are a lot of companies that lack knowledge or capacity for an organized MRV system.
MRV stands for Measure, Report, Verify, and is a basic tool to report carbon emissions. The government plans to provide funding to SMEs so they can implement it and expand consulting for employees about MRV. In addition to forming a dedicated task force, local companies can use the current domestic emission calculation system to report to the EU until the end of 2025. In an emergency economic meeting earlier this week, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho outlined some solutions going forward.
We will consult with the EU to recognise domestic emissions costs. In addition, we will actively support technology development and facility investment to reduce carbon emissions for export items to the EU, such as hydrogen-reduced steel.
The government also plans to open further negotiations with the Taxation and Customs Union of the EU next month. 문혜련, Arirang News.
Showers have now subsided for the Seoul metropolitan area, but other areas will see rain until the morning hours as a low-pressure system continues to linger across the region. 충청도 and 경상북도 provinces will see 5 to 40 millimeters, 전라북도 5 to 30. The surrounding regions will see up to 20 millimeters of rainfall. Conditions will start to get colder tomorrow morning. This is because a surge of cold air mass, which is behind the rain clouds, is getting ready to filter into the nation. Tomorrow, central regions, including Seoul, will see lows plummeting to single figures. By Saturday, colder mornings are expected with lows of only 5 degrees. We'll see a wide variation in morning temperatures across the nation. Lows range from 8 to 15 degrees nationwide. Highs in Seoul will get up to 14 degrees, Gwangju 17, Daegu and Gyeongju will be making it to 18 degrees. And for this weekend, early winter-like conditions are expected. Make sure to wrap up extra warm. It's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
Well, that's all for tonight's newscast. Thank you for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest news. Good night.
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, look my way. Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid,